So, spent more than 20 years as a correspondent. I'm American, and I've worked as an American foreign correspondent in Berlin and Moscow. Basically, started my career in Berlin, then went to Moscow, then went back to Berlin, and then I had one final stint in Moscow before I came to the United States. I grew up in Illinois, in the Midwest, in a small town during the Cold War, and this was a time when the Soviet Union was our big enemy. We knew very little about what was actually happening there, and I think it's hard, especially for younger people, to imagine a world in which information was actually a very rare good and existed in libraries and in books, but if you didn't have access to these resources, it was often very difficult to get a full picture of the world. So the Soviet Union was also behind the famous Iron Curtain, and there just wasn't a lot of information, up-to-date information. I remember reading books when I was growing up as a kid that were, decades old about the Soviet Union. When I was a student, the Iron Curtain came down, the Berlin Wall fell, and it suddenly became open. I mean, everything that had been locked away from people in the West suddenly became open, and I did quite a lot of traveling. Yeah, the summer after the Berlin Wall came down, I did a lot of traveling in Central Europe, and I made my first visit to Moscow in 1991. That was the final year of the Soviet Union's existence. And I think it's really hard for people today to understand the sense of euphoria that people felt in the United States and all across Europe and all across the Soviet Union at this time. People understood that, an old system was disappearing, and that things that people couldn't imagine hadn't been able to imagine a few years earlier were suddenly possible. And that included people going from Western countries to the East, but also for people coming from the former communist bloc coming to the West. I think there was a really sense of great hope about what the future brought. I certainly remember my time as a student as a very hopeful time, that the world was changing in a very positive direction. One of the songs of the time was Winds of Change by the Scorpions. I don't know how many people are familiar with this song. It's a rather cheesy anthem to these changes. And just the other night, I have a 5-year-old son, and he was giving a dance performance to this song. And I started listening to the words, and I was just thinking, as cheesy as the song is, it really encapsulates the hopes that people all over the world felt. And here I will say in parentheses, obviously, 1989 was also a key year for China, and of course, the Tiananmen Square massacre was a sign of the old power and what could still happen. I am fully conscious that while it was a year of euphoria for people in Europe and in China, it was also a great shock and a great tragedy. This euphoria about possibilities of future, I would say, dissipated quite quickly. There were real monumental changes going on in the former Soviet bloc. Widespread poverty also accompanied the collapse of communism, and people lost their livelihoods. There was, even though a lot of countries became independent from Moscow, for many of the citizens, it was, in concrete terms, this chaotic transition to capitalism also had a very high human cost. And I think, especially in Russia, there was already in the 90s, there was a growing disappointment and a disillusionment in the West. Maybe the changes didn't happen fast enough as people wanted. And this certainly accompanied Putin's rise to power. Putin came to power in the year 2000. When I first moved to Moscow was during his first term in 2000, at the end of 2003. Russia was experiencing an unprecedented oil boom, probably the greatest accumulation of wealth and distribution of wealth through the population in Russian history. And that disillusionment and that disappointment with the West also accompanied this oil boom. In the subsequent years, I watched Russia go from a rather chaotic, wild, capitalistic place into a very rigid dictatorship. In those years, I also began exploring Ukraine, and I would say I actually discovered Ukraine as a country. I first went there in 2004. 2005, in January 2005, right after the famous Orange Revolution, which was one of a series of people power revolutions in central Kiev. That memory of Kiev also in 2005 in some ways reminded me a lot of the feeling I felt in 1990 in Europe. It was a people power revolution in favor of Ukraine choosing a Western direction. And it was certainly the kind of people power revolution that was inspired by the peaceful revolutions of 1989 in Central Europe, in East Germany, and in Czechoslovakia. So I continued traveling to Ukraine when I lived in Moscow. It's very hard to imagine this today. The two countries are at war, but it was as normal to go from Moscow to Kiev or from Kiev to Moscow as it is to go from Washington to New York. There were dozens of flights, overnight trains. You could fly to also provincial cities in Ukraine from Moscow. All the old ties of the Soviet Union were still around, and it was very easy to get there. And so I fell in love with Kiev, and I spent a lot of time in Kiev, but I also was curious about the rest of the country, so I did quite a lot of traveling around Ukraine. Some of this was just as a tourist, not necessarily as a journalist. I became more familiar with Ukraine's difficult relations with Russia when I was a reporter at Bloomberg News covering energy, and specifically I covered the Russian energy company Gazprom. And this is where I became acquainted with geopolitics of energy and the way that Russia maintained its control of Ukraine through energy subsidies or discounts. And that's how, for a long time in the 1990s and the early 2000s, Russia was able to maintain its control over Ukraine. I moved to the US, back to the US in 2021, 25 years abroad as a foreign correspondent. I came to Washington to take a fellowship at the Wilson Center, which unfortunately has now been all but closed by the Trump administration. I received a fellowship, I began working on one book project, and then full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened in February 2022. I realized that I couldn't go on with my old project. I remember speaking to a good Ukrainian friend, and she was actually running from the Russians. She was in Kiev, and she was running away from the Russians with her family, staying outside of Kiev. And I was telling her how helpless I felt. I was in Georgetown. I said, how can I help you? What can I do? My instinct was, of course, to go back to Ukraine, but I was on a fellowship. I was here with my family. I didn't have a journalistic assignment. I couldn't go back to Ukraine at that moment. My friend Tanya, she said, well, you know our story, and now it's time for you to tell the world what you know. And I realized that, in fact, I had been a witness as a reporter to the beginnings of the war, starting as far back as these so-called gas wars between Russia and Ukraine. I had been a witness to the aftermath of the Orange Revolution, and in 2014 I had covered the beginning of the Russian invasion. And I realized that actually that would probably be the most useful contribution I could make sitting in Washington. Just as background to this book, it is a project that I actually tried to get off the ground already in 2015, 2016, after the initial Russian invasion. I had a very well-regarded New York book agent who tortured me for almost a year to write writing a book proposal. And finally he came back to me and said, nobody in New York cares about Ukraine. That was in 2016. So I had already ideas about how I want to approach this book, and I returned to it. I had a very tight deadline, so I realized I would have to rely on the notes I had already taken, the interviews I had already made as a journalist, and also look at actually a vast body of interviews with key players that appeared in the Ukrainian and Russian press, but were not necessarily widely known outside of the Russian and Ukrainian speaking world. As for the title of the book, to me, it was obvious: Putin's Revenge. This is essentially a story of revenge, well, not only by one man, by, I think, a whole generation of Russians. And first and foremost, this is revenge against Ukrainians who chose a different, or wanted to choose their own destiny and get out from under Russian control. It was also revenge against the West. In Putin's eyes, the West had rejected Russia and certainly rejected Russia's attempt to establish a sphere of influence. He felt like Russia wasn't being recognized as a great power, deserved to dominate over other countries. And I think in some sense it's also a revenge against history. The fact that Russia had emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union a much diminished power after several centuries of quite incredible expansion. So I will now discuss a couple of the main themes of the book. Sort of the subtitle of the book is why Russia invaded Ukraine. I knew already when I started writing this book that the causes of this war would in some sense become controversial. Of course, as a correspondent working in Russia and monitoring the Russian state news, I was very familiar with Kremlin narratives. And already beginning in 2014, in the West, there were voices echoed the Russian narratives about NATO being to blame, NATO expansion, and US policy. Here I want to say that I've always been a skeptic of US power, and especially US military power. For me, I think one of the really key moments, the way I viewed my own government, was the invasion of Iraq. I come from a skeptical point of view, but as someone who covered these events, especially in 2014, I knew that the narratives out there about the US being to blame or NATO being to blame were much too simplistic and really didn't reflect what happened. Also, a problem with the narrative that it was NATO's fault or the US did it, it's very US-centric, right? It sort of denies agency to anybody else. I mean, first and foremost to Ukrainians, but also other people in Central and Eastern Europe who really thought that their countries should be in NATO. And of course, it also denies agency to Russians themselves. I mean, they also made certain fateful choices that would lead to this war. So discussing the main conclusions of this book, I don't think these are going to be spoilers. I reveal these spoilers my main conclusions in the introduction. So they're all out there. I think there are two main drivers for this war. First one is Russian imperialism. Russian imperialism being the idea that Russia has a destiny or has a historic mission, to be at the center of a Eurasian land empire. And it doesn't matter if this empire is called the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. This is something Russia was destined to be. For Putin and his whole cohort in the Soviet security agencies, the collapse of the Soviet Union was really a huge loss. It was a complete disaster. But I also argue that simply this nostalgia for the Soviet Union, for a great empire, this is not enough to actually drive one country to invade another. There's also another key ingredient, or I would say a key driver, and that is Putin's growing dictatorship, or in other words, Russia's failure to become a democracy. The longer Putin stayed in power, the more paranoid he became about his own power base. And he became convinced that the United States, the Russians like to call it the collective West as a whole, was out to get him. And the longer he stayed in power, the more he saw revolutions in other countries, the more he became convinced that his own regime was under threat. Saying all that, of course, this was not a predetermined war. Putin carries the main responsibility for usurping power in Russia. And it's not that Putin only took power in some, general way, but very specifically, he took power from a generation of Russians that might have been able to modernize Russia, or that might have been able to take Russia in a different direction. Putin effectively sidelined representatives of a new post-Soviet generation. Representatives of that generation being, during Putin's first terms in office, the oil oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and more recently the opposition leader Alexei Navalny. As far as what role NATO played, of course NATO played a role in all of this. I devote a whole chapter just to what the Americans were doing at this time, and exactly, and an underlying theme throughout the whole book is looking at at how NATO interacted with Ukraine and with Russia. I think the tragedy of this whole story of Ukraine is that despite all this talk about membership, no US president, except George W. Bush, was ever really interested in Ukraine getting NATO membership. So we have to think back to the year 2008. That was the last year that George W. Bush's presidency, well, he was a lame duck since he could not be reelected, and he decided to use the last NATO summit of his presidency as a way to push Ukraine and also the country of Georgia of getting membership action plans, so-called membership action plans that would guide them into NATO. Why did George W. Bush do this? Well, after the disastrous invasion of Iraq, he needed countries that would support him, and Ukraine was one of the countries that volunteered to send troops to Iraq as part of the occupation force. And to reward Ukraine, George W. Bush decided that he was, as part of his so-called freedom agenda, he wanted to reward Ukraine and Georgia by giving them these plans how to get into NATO. At the time, it was very controversial. It was controversial inside Ukraine. There was no majority of Ukrainians at the time that wanted to join NATO. Many people in Ukraine were afraid that their boys would be sent to fight NATO's wars in other countries. And so there was definitely no consensus within Ukrainian society that this was even a good idea. And within NATO, there was also a lot of opposition led by Germany and France, which traditionally have had a lot of, some people would say, too much understanding for the Russian point of view. So the Bush administration, in its efforts to bring Ukraine into NATO, met a lot of opposition inside the NATO alliance, and they finally found a compromise solution in which, in the final declaration of that summit in Bucharest, Romania, it said that Ukraine and Russia would one day become NATO members without specifying when or under what conditions. And so I think George W. Bush, he carries responsibility for a lot of things. I'm thinking now about the condition of the Middle East, but even in Ukraine, here he opened the door to Ukrainians' NATO membership, but the alliance itself had no intention of letting Ukraine in. So this put Ukraine in an extremely vulnerable position. In one hand, they were going to join. On the other hand, everybody understood that they were never going to join. And vis-a-vis a revanchist Russia, this made Ukraine extremely vulnerable. So my book is organized in 11 chapters. They are chronological. And my goal here was really to write a definitive history of what happened. Before the full-scale invasion. What were the events that led up to full-scale invasion in 2022? What were the main motivations for Putin? Why did he finally decide? As I mentioned, I already knew at the time I started this book that this would become a recurring factor or recurring question. Why did he finally decide to launch a full-scale invasion against Iraq? And as we know, even today, more than 100 years later, people are still discussing why did World War I start, for example. I saw this first and foremost as my contribution, certainly as a journalist, but also to contribute a first stab at writing a history. I did not have any particular agenda in mind. I simply wanted to portray the events as I had seen them, while at the same time removing myself a little bit from the background. So I am there in almost every chapter, but I try to insert my own observations as a reporter sort of as the background. This is not a story about my journalistic reporting. It's more I am trying to support larger arguments and larger things that I observed. I decided to start my book with the Orange Revolution in 2004 in Ukraine. As I already mentioned, that was one of the great people power revolutions where, after rigged elections that favored a Kremlin-backed candidate, Ukrainians took to the streets of Kiev, and with no bloodshed, no violence, were able to pressure the government to call a revote. For people power, it was a great victory, and for Vladimir Putin, it was a devastating moment. He had invested so much in the preparation for this election. He had traveled to Ukraine in 2004 half a dozen times. So when we talk about election interference, there was certainly a lot of election interference. And I think it also reflected the way that Putin viewed Ukraine as simply just another Russian region where he could freely act, and that his will would also be respected. That is the beginning of the chapter of the book. I decided to end my book with February 24th, 2022, the day of the full-scale invasion. So that I would have a very clear, what we call narrative arc, with a story that has a beginning, middle, and end. I have colleagues and friends who have also written excellent books on Ukraine. Many of them are out in the field, and they had this problem writing their books that they didn't know how their story was going to end, right? And so often these stories end. The books that we have on the present war, we have sort of leaving the reader hanging because you don't know what happened next. So my goal was really to describe the prequel to what we're seeing now. The first chapter discusses the Orange Revolution and is actually entitled Putin in Kiev, and opens with Putin reviewing a military parade in October 2004 in Kiev, marking, I don't want to get the anniversaries wrong, there are so many anniversaries, but marking an anniversary of the Nazi Germany being expelled from Soviet Ukraine in World War II. And his goal eventually in 2022 was actually to have a second victory parade. Of course, that was denied to him by Ukrainians fighting for their country. In the second chapter, I look at the war in Georgia. As I'd mentioned before, Georgia was another former Soviet republic that had been given this vague promise of joining NATO one day in the future. And just months after that NATO summit, which took place, I believe, in April 2008, the Beijing Olympics began, and at the same time, a brief war took place between Georgia and Russia. I think the main takeaways about Russia's invasion of Georgia is that this was in some ways the beginning of a playbook that would happen again in Ukraine. And many people in the West, they thought that they wanted to see this as a one-off, right? This was, okay, the Russians were provoked by a very temperamental leader. They were forced to react, but we will continue business as usual. And amazingly, after Russia's first military intervention since the Soviet war in Afghanistan, there were no consequences in terms of Western sanctions. And again, George W. Bush was on his way out. He was just about half a year away from retirement as president, and there was very little that the United States was going to do. And in some ways, this was also Putin testing, his sphere of influence, and testing it rather successfully from his point of view. In this chapter on Georgia, I also explore the rather curious relationship between George Bush and Vladimir Putin. They had a very warm personal relationship. There was no foreign leader that Bush didn't meet with more times. I believe they met something like 40 times at various international functions, and Russia was the country that Bush visited most often. And in fact, shortly after that, the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008, actually George Bush took a trip, his last trip to Russia to see Putin. So on one level, there was a very warm personal relationship between these two leaders, and at the same time we have already Putin feeling like his overtures to the West were being denied. I think it's a very well-known story that after the September 11th attacks in 2001, Putin was the first foreign leader to call Bush and offer his help. And in some ways, Vladimir Putin felt like he had been rebuffed, that he had been rejected, that his efforts to help the Americans were rejected. And then, of course, in the lead up to the Iraq War, in 2003, he became one of its loudest opponents. It's very strange. In some ways, the U.S.-Russian relations became worse and worse during the Bush administration, while on a personal level, Bush and Vladimir Putin managed to keep it extremely cordial. What's interesting about this relationship is that Putin began to see Bush as a sort of as a model, as someone to emulate. So he was furious that the United States was doing all these things, for example, going and invading Iraq, which was, of course, an enormous show of force and just how strong and wealthy the United States was, so that the US had the power to even launch such an invasion. So in some ways he was furious about it, but it was almost motivated by a sense of envy. During my time in Moscow, during the Iraq War, a friend of mine visited me from Berlin, and we were discussing the different reactions. The Germans were very much against the Iraq War, and the Russians were against them. And I tried to explain to my friend from Berlin the difference, because I told him that Germans were outraged about the Iraq War because they thought it was a moral outrage, that it was a war of aggression, that this should never come to pass. And the Russians' motivation for being against the Iraq War was quite different. It was more of a feeling of envy, like we wish we could do this. So I think in some ways, in Putin's mind, Bush's unilateral military action actually became a sort of inspiration, and that we would see that come back when he began his military operations against Ukraine. In my book, I try to discuss events happening inside Ukraine, of course, what the US was doing in Europe, but I also focus on domestic developments inside of Russia, because as I mentioned before, one of my main arguments is that Russia's failure to become a democracy also led to this war. I focus several chapters on domestic developments, and in late 2011, quite surprisingly, we saw Russians take to the streets en masse in huge demonstrations. I was there for most of them. The trigger was some rigged parliamentary elections, but the real reason why Russians were so unhappy was that Putin was coming back for a third term in office. And this was probably his most vulnerable moment during the 25 years that he's been in power, these mass protests. And it's, again, very indicative of his thinking. When the protests began, Vladimir Putin blamed Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State at the time, for sending a signal to the US agents inside Russia. So the protests in Russia for Putin and for his circle of advisors was really, in some ways, a warning shot. And of course, this came in the context of the Arab Spring protests. Just a few years after this wave of protests in Russia, we saw a second set of protests begin on Ukraine's Maidan Square. Now I'm coming to chapter 4 of my book. The core chapters of my book are focused on what actually happened in 2014. So we hear a lot, especially from the Kremlin right now, saying that all these peace talks do not address, or talk of peace talks do not address the root causes, what the Kremlin calls root causes of the war. And often when Russian officials meet American counterparts, they begin then with their litany of complaints. And you hear this also in right-wing and left-wing media in the West, that there was a US-sponsored coup in Kiev in 2014, and that there were Ukrainian neo-Nazis that were going after Russian speakers, and that Russia was forced to intervene. This is sort of the official Kremlin narrative in a nutshell. And that's why I devote quite a lot of time to 3 chapters to what actually happened in 2014. The pace of events was really dizzying at the time. First of all, protests, as I mentioned, broke out. They broke out because Ukraine's president at the time, he was the same guy who lost the rigged elections in the Orange Revolution, Viktor Yanukovych. He was put before a very difficult choice. He had actually, surprisingly, negotiated an association agreement with the European Union that would have put Ukraine on track, or at the beginning of a long path to EU membership. And once the Kremlin realized what was going on, they put Ukraine under enormous pressure. They put economic sanctions on Ukraine, and at the end, Viktor Yanukovych ended up backing out of this agreement, causing people once again in Ukraine to take to the streets. And unfortunately, the so-called Maidan protests of 2013 and 2014, also called the Euromaidan, because of the emphasis of the protesters that they wanted Ukraine to take a European course and not a Russian course. I say that the events were so head-spinning because those events, unlike the Orange Revolution in 2004, quickly descended into violence. I think Viktor Yanukovych was under a lot of pressure from Putin, and he was reminding him what happened the last time in the Orange Revolution when people started putting up tents and making a protest camp on Kiev's central square. So he resorted to violence very early, sending riot police against students, which really backfired. The fact that he sent riot police to clear a very small protest camp actually brought tens and hundreds of thousands of people onto the street in Ukraine. And again, this was a moment, I think, when world media attention focused on Ukraine. The scenes that were coming out of Kiev, if you might remember, I compare it in my book to almost like medieval battles. You have the riot police in their helmets and shields and clubs, fighting these protesters who have Molotov cocktails. For a while, the protesters even used a catapult, a medieval weapon, against the police. These were pitched battles in the center of Kiev, and people began to get killed quite soon into these protests. The protests themselves already took on a different character, and they finally culminated in February 2014, a massacre on the Maidan where dozens of protesters were killed. That was the exact day I arrived in Ukraine. Up to that point, I was living in Berlin. I had moved away from Moscow. I had decided to try to do something non-Eastern Europe related and start a media startup in Berlin, but events kept on drawing me back. And I remember the night of great violence on February 18th, 2014. I was in a TV studio in Berlin commenting the event. I knew the Maidan Square. It's one of the great landmarks of Kiev, and seeing just ambulance after ambulance after ambulance on the webcam driving up to the protest just broke my heart, and I realized I needed to be there. I needed to see with my own eyes what was going on. 2 days later, on February 20th, I arrived. I mean, it was quite dramatic. On the way to the airport in Berlin, I was scrolling through the news, and the death count, the death toll of protesters kept on climbing. Then I got into the airplane and I landed in Kiev a couple of hours later, and I didn't recognize the city anymore. In my mind, Kiev was always sort of a sunny place, especially after Moscow, where you could relax. And on that day in February 2014, the streets were abandoned. People were very scared because there were government-paid thugs that were roaming the streets, and there had been severe bloodshed in the central square. Nobody really understood what would happen next. There were European Union foreign ministers who came to negotiate. They tried to negotiate a deal between Yanukovych and the protesters, and it seemed like a compromise had been reached. The problem was that Yanukovych's power base was beginning to crumble. So his party was also in the majority in parliament, but after this horrible bloodshed, people started fleeing his party. The Ukrainian elite that around Yanukovych, in the nights after the initial violence, they started fleeing. They put their families on planes and left. So Viktor Yanukovych basically saw his support base crumble before his eyes, and most dramatically, the Ukrainian riot police that had defended him also began leaving. They just packed up and started leaving Kiev. So without many options, Viktor Yanukovych left his own capital and he flew to Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine. And eastern Ukraine is sort of where Viktor Yanukovych had his power base. And I think his initial idea, I mean, I studied a lot of the things he said at the time and what other people remembered from the time. I think his idea was maybe somehow to rally support for, his government. But everywhere he went, in Kharkiv and then in Donetsk, which was his political hometown, he met opposition from people. His close allies were telling him, you need to step down after such horrible violence. And so Viktor Yanukovych ended up running away. He tried to drive to Crimea. Vladimir Putin helped him escape. In the Russian telling, it was helped him escape. And the more I analyzed the information that is really out there, I reached the conclusion that in some ways it was much more of a Russian kidnapping of Viktor Yanukovych than Russian helping him. The Russians needed Viktor Yanukovych out of Ukraine in order to annex Crimea. Once he was outside of the country, it made the annexation of Crimea much easier. From his, quote, Russian exile, Viktor Yanukovych could then sign the necessary papers, and he did sign 2 key documents that would allow for the annexation and give this kind of sheen of legitimacy to what the Russians were doing. Meantime, of course, in Kiev, people were taking things into their own hands. The parliament, the Ukrainian parliament, in the face of a power vacuum, elected its own president, who was a speaker of parliament, because Viktor Yanukovych was basically AWOL. He was nowhere to be found. As we know, he ended up in Russia. So there was a very weak provisional government in Ukraine, made the annexation of Crimea so easy for the Russians, and which led then also Russia to begin an insurgency in eastern Ukraine. These were the core chapters of my book on what really happened in 2014. Then I discuss what the Americans were doing. In fact, the Americans were not building up forces in Europe. They were drawing down. The U.S. symbolically removed its last Abrams battle tank from Germany in 2013. So instead of encircling Russia, Americans were very interested in leaving Europe, and that was, of course, under Barack Obama. Famous pivot to China. Just like Trump after him, he had no interest really in Europe. He saw America's foreign policy future in Asia. I end my book with a chapter examining the nature of Russian nationalism and discussing in some detail how Alexei Navalny, a figure that many people outside of Russia have heard of, but who has a very contradictory background. I end then with the unexpected rise of Volodymyr Zelensky, a comedian, as the president of Ukraine. In quite a lot of detail, I go into the last 2 years before the war, which saw Trump leave office and Joe Biden come into office. I'm happy to discuss anything in greater detail. Thank you.
I want to ask, given what you know about the start of the war, what do you see as the major impediments to ending it?
I think one thing that we hear now coming out of the Trump administration is this idea that, we've heard this from Steve Witkoff, who is Donald Trump's special envoy to Russia, this idea that it's all about 5 regions, and he doesn't even know the names of these 5 regions. The 5 regions are Crimea, and then Donetsk Oblast and Luhansk Oblast, Zaporizhia, Kherson. So these are 5 regions of Ukraine that Russia now claims belong to it. This is a very simplistic understanding of the conflict. If you say, well, if you give them these territories, then the war will end and the Russians will be happy. This is not a war of territorial conquest per se. When Putin made his declaration of war on the eve of the full-scale invasion, he said, we don't plan to occupy Ukraine. And I think at the moment, he was actually telling the truth. I think the Russian plan was sort of a shock and awe takeover of all of Ukraine to decapitate the Ukrainian government and install a Russian-friendly regime. That was, I think, the idea. That's why they also called it a special military operation. I think they sincerely believed that this would be a cakewalk. This would be over in a couple of weeks. So to get back to this question, it's about controlling Ukraine, about subordinating the whole country. It's not about controlling certain regions. And I think this is the key impediment right now, is if you give Putin 5 regions, he'll stop. This is not what it was ever about. It was about putting in his own people, his own puppet government in Ukraine, and going back to the olden days where Ukraine was very dependent on Russia especially for energy. Vladimir Putin was fine with Ukraine being an a nominally independent country, as long as it didn't align in a military alliance, and as long as its leaders ultimately took their orders from the Kremlin. Of course, that's not going to happen anymore. Ukraine is a completely different country from what it was even 10 years ago. Ukrainians have also said that this is unacceptable.
Do you think there's anything possible Ukraine or Ukraine's leadership can avoid the war?
That's a fantastic question, and I think it also ties into a lot of what we're hearing now. If you listen to the news and you hear Donald Trump talking, right? He's blaming, in some sense, Zelensky and Joe Biden and everybody else but him for somehow not preventing the war. Again, this is kind of a very selective reading of history and what really happened. First of all, I think we should be clear that Russian invasion of Ukraine began with the completely unprovoked takeover of Crimea. So before 2014, most Ukrainians, if you look at the polls, viewed Russia as a friendly neighbor. The border was completely open. People traveled back and forth all the time, as I said at the beginning of my talk. And I was in Crimea when the Russians arrived. One day The Russians already had a naval base in Crimea, but one day you see Russian troops fanning out across Crimea. This was completely unprovoked. I mean, Crimea was a rather unique military operation, and for a number of reasons, it was largely bloodless and it was lightning attack. But it's not seen, as a battle because it was almost without any bloodshed. However, following the illegal annexation of Crimea, the Russians also fomented a violent insurgency in eastern Ukraine. And again, I mean, you can't really blame the Ukrainians. They had a provisional government at the beginning. Then they had, despite the situation, they had presidential elections in May of 2014, and they were always on the back foot. They had almost no army to work with. Their intelligence services were completely undermined by Russian agents. Ukraine was really already then the victim of unprovoked aggression. Because one thing that sometimes gets lost is that in 2014, once it kind of Ukrainians understood what was going on, that Russians were, fomenting this insurgency in eastern Ukraine, Ukraine actually had quite a successful counterinsurgency. During the summer of 2014, they could have actually ended this insurgency had the Russian regular army not intervened in a couple of key battles. And that's where Ukraine, lost most of its armor, suffered huge casualties. The duly elected president, Petro Poroshenko, he was forced basically to sign a peace agreement, Minsk I agreement. And that was in September 2014. The Russians kept on fighting. They were forced to sign then a Minsk II agreement in February 2015. In some ways, it ended the bleeding. Of course, there are a lot of people who blame the provisional government for letting the Crimea occupation happen, that blame Poroshenko for not stamping out this insurgency, but as far as I can tell, they did what they could. They didn't have enough manpower, they didn't have the equipment to fight against the Russians. So there was, for all these years, there was the Minsk agreements, which foresaw some kind of peaceful resolution. The Minsk agreement was an agreement that was signed under duress by the Ukrainians, and they were forced with this dilemma. They could try to implement the Minsk agreement, but by implementing the Minsk agreement, they would have had to grant these eastern provinces vast autonomy. They would have also had to have elections in these Russian-occupied regions before the Russian military actually left. And so no Ukrainian government could actually fulfill these provisions of the Minsk agreement without facing serious unrest from its own population. When Volodymyr Zelensky became president in 2019, he came out of the blue and he said things that made a lot of Ukrainians worry. He said, we need to end this war. And it was a low-level insurgency at the time. But Zelensky said, I want to end this war. I want to sit down with Vladimir Putin. And when he came into power, he was actually ready. He wanted to renegotiate these Minsk agreements. He actually wanted the United States to take part in the Minsk discussions, also other countries, including Great Britain. He tried to take some steps to fulfill the Minsk agreements, and he met with very strong domestic opposition. And he found zero readiness by the Russians to, renegotiate, give any leeway on implementing the Minsk agreements. In the end, the two sides were really at loggerheads. I honestly don't know what the Ukrainians could have done differently. And this resulted, of course, in Putin doing a big military buildup in spring 2021 when Biden had just been inaugurated, and then doing a second build-up in the fall of 2021, which of course led to the full-scale invasion.
There's a very contested topic if it's Russia's war, Putin's war.
My answer to that is also because the name of my book, it is Putin's revenge. I do think that the nature of the regime really needed this war. One thing I point out in my book is that I lived in Russia for many years before takeover of Crimea, and not one time did I hear any Russians tell me that, we miss Crimea so much, we need to have it back. This was really something that, the mayor of Moscow, Yuri Lushkov, was obsessed with Crimea, and Vladimir Zhirinovsky, the ultra-nationalist clown politician in Russia, they were obsessed with Crimea. But normal people spoke a lot about Crimea, how much they loved it, but I did not hear them say that they felt any need to take it from Ukraine. I do still think in some ways Putin drove this war, right? And it was also his phobias and his obsessions. I mean, is to this day obsessed this idea that Russia cannot be an empire without Ukraine. So he was the driver. I don't see that, if you take Putin out of the equation, I don't see, Russia necessarily, going in this direction of fighting an imperialist war. You can put the name, and this is of course a very rich subject. You could put, what would have happened if Alexei Navalny, through some miracle, had become president of Russia? A lot of Ukrainians will say, well, watch out for what you wish for, because Alexei Navalny himself, I had a chance to interview him, and I talked to him about this. He called himself a Russian nationalist. I think what's interesting about Navalny, though, is, and I go into some detail in my book, he was very critical, actually, when it looked like Russia was taking over Crimea. He wrote about this publicly, about how imperialism is a bad thing, and that Russia actually has plenty of land and doesn't need any more land. And so I think Navalny's idea of nationalism, and this is an idea that also got him into a lot of trouble, but Navalny's idea of nationalism was Russia as a nation state, sort of in a 19th century way, because Russia never was a nation state during the 19th century like most European countries, and it was always an empire, and Russians understood themselves to be at the center of this empire. A President Navalny would not necessarily have invaded Ukraine, and I think the personality of Putin was a key ingredient. Also the fact that he came from the KGB, he felt personally aggrieved. He remembered his time as a security KGB officer in East Germany and watching these people power revolutions change history, and the Soviet Union being completely impotent to step in and reverse that.
In our analysis, we see that China is one of the major factors that helps Putin conduct this war in Ukraine in 2022. Can you please comment on that? What's China's interest in it, and what are the elements of interest between China and Russia in this war?
I think the Chinese interests are obvious in terms of the influence that can be gained, right? The harder the sanctions, the Western sanctions have been against Russia, the more willing China has been to become a trade partner, and now by far the leading trade partner of Russia. And in some ways, I'm not adding any original analysis, but of course people also point out that in this relationship between China and Russia, clearly following the full-scale Ukrainian invasion, China has gained the most, and Russia is the much weaker party in this relationship because it's so dependent. And we have this news just from the last couple of weeks where Zelensky said that the Ukrainian military had captured 2 Chinese nationals fighting for the Russians on Ukrainian soil. This is a little bit different than the North Koreans. The North Koreans were fighting on Russian soil against Ukrainians, and here we have Chinese fighting on Russian soil. Well, the Ukrainians say that that they've identified some 150 Chinese nationals. Beijing, of course, says this is all untrue. And just today, Zelensky says that there is now that the Ukrainians have evidence that Russia has been receiving arms, gunpowder, and artillery from the Chinese, and that the Chinese might also be producing weapons inside Russia. And of course, Zelensky is no less a showman than Donald Trump. He said that this information will become public next week. So I think this will probably also play into Ukraine's attempts to get the Trump administration's attention again and sort of present China as an ultimate enemy in this battle, or one of them.
What possibilities might happen in a post-Putin future Russia?
Something I describe in my book is I returned to Russia as a correspondent in December 2016, so just a month after Donald Trump was elected the first time. It was an interesting experience because Russia, even in those years that I had been gone, had become so much more repressive. You could really feel that the Putin's regime was becoming much, much harsher. But I say in my book that was not the most surprising thing about my second stay in Moscow. The most surprising thing that I experienced in my second stay in Moscow was that I discovered a new generation of Russians. And these are people that don't get a lot of media publicity because they've been completely omitted from any kind of public debates. I mean, Russia's run by now a small clique of old men with links to the I think almost all of them are from the KGB, with deep resentment over the US and the West. And the young Russians I met, they really surprised me because in years previous to that, I had always been struck going to Moscow how different young Russians were from myself, and also from the music that people listened to, from their cultural reference points, and even from their historical reference points. And I'm really talking about people probably born under Putin in the 2000s. These are people who, got most of their information from the internet and from cultural cues originating in the West. And I was surprised that I discovered people that were very open-minded, were on a similar wavelength to young people in the West. I began to call these Russians New Russians because New Russians refers in Russia to the millionaires, the nouveau riche Russians of the 1990s. And to me, who were very gaudy and flaunting their wealth, I think in China you probably also have a class like that. For me, these new Russians, they were just new people. They were not contaminated with this Soviet thinking. They didn't have delusions of grandeur that Russia had to be some great power. All the stuff that was coming out of the Kremlin, I was not hearing from these people, and they were very open to the world. So all I can say is that a lot of these people, a lot of young Russians fled their country at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, but most of them did not, and they're still inside Russia. Russia has become such a closed box to outside observers that it's very hard to understand exactly what do Russian people think. How big is the support really for the war? We don't know the answer to these questions. But I can say I do have hope for those other Russians that I met that lived lives that were completely parallel to the Kremlin's propaganda and really the Kremlin's fury at the rest of the world.
Do the general Russian public willing to talk to you when they know that you are from the Western media?
All I can say is that my experience working as a foreign correspondent in Moscow was great. I had accreditation from the Russian Foreign Ministry, a little green card that would get me past most security checkpoints, anything. It was always there. I felt like I could do whatever I wanted. I never felt like I was under any pressure, even as the Putin regime was clamping down on Russian journalism, domestic journalism, Russian language journalism. They did not touch foreign correspondence. We were kind of like off limits. It was very privileged, I should say, a position to have. So I never felt like anyone intervened in my work. Of course, it's a completely different question who wanted to talk to me. That was an increasing problem, and I know my colleagues who worked in Russia in the 1990s, after the fall of communism, this was a great time to be a journalist in Russia because everybody would talk to you. In the 2000s, as this fear and as Putin consolidated power and really fear spread through Russia, fewer and fewer people were willing to talk to you about anything. They would just, even about the most banal things. And I'm talking here about officials, especially lower level officials or regional officials. They hated talking because there was no benefit in talking to a Western journalist. You could only get in trouble because you probably said something wrong. So that was one problem. And I have to say, as a correspondent for NPR, I had a lot of problems getting ordinary people to talk because I remember once they were thinking of raising the pension age in Russia, and I just went out to the metro station near my apartment and tried to talk to people. I could not find a single person who wanted to talk to me. I introduced myself as a reporter for American radio. I want to get your opinions on the pension age. And one guy said, I have an opinion, but I'm not going to tell you. And it was this idea that you're an American, you're an enemy, and you are going to use our trouble to say bad things about our country. So no, and it was this wall of silence. So it was, unfortunately, it was very difficult to find people, especially since we had a rule at NPR. I think it's been loosened in a lot of media, but at the time where I had to use people's full names. So people often gave their first names, but were not willing to give their full names. And if you asked them for their full names, they were like, being paranoid Russians, they would say, why do you want my full name? What are you going to do with this information? And is someone going to show up at my doorstep the next day? It became increasingly more difficult. And as I describe in my book, at the end, when I left in 2021, I was so relieved because there was nothing to report on Russia anymore. It had become a full-blown dictatorship, and the only thing that I could report on was new repressions, new people being thrown in jail on ridiculous charges, and it was an extremely depressing job.
And round of applause for